Power couldn't buy a miracle, until one arrived in dirty boots and quiet hands. Victoria Harrington had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without blinking. She dismantled empires with a signature, bent senators to her will, and silenced boardrooms with a single raised brow. But that morning, her hands trembled as she tried to lift her espresso cup. Across the tinted glass wall of her penthouse office, her 4-year-old son, Christopher, sat cross-legged on the carpet, perfectly still, perfectly silent, perfectly unaware that his mother's world was quietly shattering. Christopher had been born deaf, and no matter how many deals Victoria struck, how many specialists she flew in, or how many institutions she funded, her son remained untouched by all of it. She had built her life on control, on power, on making the impossible negotiable. But fate, in the form of her son's silence, would not yield. Doctors offered surgeries with low odds. Therapists offered long, uncertain paths. Experts delivered data, percentages, and polite expressions of helplessness. None of it softened the piercing ache of watching her child live in a world sealed off from sound, from lullabies, from laughter, from her voice. And then, just as she began to surrender to despair, fate sent another silence into her world. A man named Steve Lamar, a gardener, quiet, unassuming, with strong hands, kind eyes, and a past that seemed to echo with stories no one dared ask about. She hired him to tend to the roses. She didn't know he'd be the one to bring her son to life, or that he would challenge the very foundation on which she'd built everything she thought she knew. Before you step into the story today, remember something. The world is full of moments we scroll past without realizing they could alter someone's life. If this story moves even one part of you, a breath, a heartbeat, a memory, tap the like button now so more people can find it. And subscribe, because the next story might be the doorway someone else has been waiting for. Now let's dive into the story. The first morning Steve Lamar arrived at the Harrington estate, the sun hadn't yet burned through the fog trailing the hedges. He moved quietly, like someone who'd lived too long on land that didn't belong to him. His hands were calloused, but careful, as if even the roses deserved gentleness. Victoria didn't greet him. She rarely acknowledged staff beyond a nod, but Steve didn't mind. He had work to do. He noticed Christopher before anyone pointed him out, a small figure pressed against the glass, legs crossed, watching the garden below like it was another planet. Something about the boy's stillness wasn't boredom. It was focus. By the second day, Steve saw it. The way Christopher's head tilted when the rake scraped stone. How his fingers fluttered when the wind rustled the oak branches. The boy didn't respond to voices, but he noticed movement. He felt rhythm. Steve remembered how Maria, his late wife, had started walking barefoot when the nerves in her ears gave out. "I can't hear the music anymore," she said once, "but I can feel the beat in the floorboards." She used to hum hymns with her hands on the piano, long after she could no longer hear the keys. God had spoken to her, even in the silence. So on the third day, Steve made a choice. He began dragging his trowel in patterns, one long stroke, too short. When he pruned the rose bushes, he tapped the handles against the ground in soft, deliberate rhythm. Stomp, pause, stomp, stomp. Up behind the glass, Christopher's head lifted. Steve didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just kept going. The next morning, Steve adjusted the hose to pulse in steady beats against the walkway. A thump of water. A pause. Another thump. Christopher pressed both palms to the glass, his eyes wide. That afternoon, the boy came outside. Not close, just to the edge of the garden path. Watching. Victoria stood on the balcony above, arms folded. "He likes the sun," she said flatly. Steve glanced up. "Or maybe he likes patterns." She blinked, visibly unsettled. He watches everything. Doesn't mean anything. Steve didn't argue. He just returned to the roses. But later, when he glanced over, Christopher wasn't watching the flowers. He was watching him. Steve whispered, almost a prayer. You see him, don't you, Lord? Even when no one else does. You haven't missed him. And maybe, just maybe, that's what mattered most. Because someone had missed Christopher. A world full of specialists, experts, and wealthy benefactors had missed the one truth Steve could see in a glance. The boy wasn't unreachable. He was waiting to be understood. Later that evening, Steve found a crumpled piece of paper tucked into his toolbox. It was from Christopher, a child's drawing of a stick man watering a flower. The flower was smiling. Steve held it in his calloused hands, his throat tightening. He hadn't realized how long it had been since someone had drawn him. He looked up at the darkening sky. Okay, God, he whispered, what are you doing here? And for the first time in years, he felt the ground shift beneath his feet, like something sacred had just begun. The evaluation ended like all the others. A soft-spoken therapist with a clipboard, a clinical voice layered with terms Victoria could no longer stomach, delayed, non-responsive, possible plateau. She stared out the window while they talked, arms folded, jaw clenched. Christopher sat beside her, swinging his legs gently, unaware that his future was being dissected in front of him. When the therapist gently suggested they adjust expectations, something snapped. Get out, Victoria said. I'm sorry. You heard me. You can submit your final invoice to Diane. The therapist blinked, opened her mouth, then wisely closed it and gathered her things. Victoria didn't wait. She left the room, heels clicking down the marble hallway as if rhythm could outrun heartbreak. She didn't go to her office. She didn't pour the usual glass of wine. She ended up near the garden. Again. And there they were. Steve, kneeling in the dirt, slowly dragging the metal rake across the soil in a slow, steady beat. One long scrape. 2 taps. One long scrape. 2 taps. Christopher stood a few feet away, watching. Then something happened. The boy moved. He turned. Not by accident. Not randomly. He turned toward the sound, or rather, the feeling of it. Victoria stopped breathing. She stepped closer, barely realizing her hands had begun to tremble again. Steve didn't look up. Christopher took a step, then another. His hand lifted, small and unsure, mirroring the rhythm. Victoria's throat tightened. What are you doing? Steve finally stood. His clothes were streaked with dirt, but there was something solid in his expression, something peaceful, teaching him to listen. He's deaf, she snapped, instantly regretting her tone. I know. She stared at him, frustrated and desperate. Then what is this? What are you trying to do? Steve set the rake down gently. Sound begins in the body before it becomes a noise. That's what most people forget. Victoria shook her head, confused. You keep trying to teach him with air, he said, his voice calm, grounded. His world starts in the ground. She looked at Christopher, who now touched the soil, fingers fluttering in small patterns, like he was writing something only he could read. Victoria felt her knees go weak. She reached out for the iron railing to steady herself. She had paid 6-figure sums for experts, flown across the country, bought devices, sat through seminars, tried every path that promised a miracle. None of it moved her son. But this man, with nothing but a rake and a memory of pain in his eyes, he had done something. Simple, profound, humbling. She didn't know whether to fire him on the spot or fall to her knees and beg for more. You ever worked with deaf kids before? She asked. Steve shook his head. Just someone I loved. Victoria couldn't speak. Christopher had begun to trace circles in the dirt, The same pattern Steve had drawn the day before. The rake lay between them, like a bridge made not of sound, but understanding. Above them, clouds gathered, not with threat, but promise. Somewhere deep in her soul, a quiet thought rose like a prayer she hadn't meant to say. Is this how grace begins? By the end of the week, the gardener had become something else entirely. Steve never asked for permission. He never spoke in long explanations or bold suggestions. He just kept showing up, rake in hand, eye steady, spirit patient. Every morning, Christopher waited near the garden path before Steve even arrived. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. But he waited, and that, Victoria knew, meant something. Steve noticed things the doctors had called irrelevant, like how Christopher would press his palms flat against the bark of the old sycamore tree when the wind moved through its leaves. "He can feel it," Steve had whispered once, watching from a few feet away. The way the wind moves through the tree, not just around it. That afternoon, Steve brought a toolbox from his truck. Not gardening tools, mechanical parts. He laid them out on a wooden bench like instruments in an orchestra. Pipes, rods, bolts, coils, all scavenged from old cars. "Each one vibrates different," he told Christopher, tapping a copper pipe gently. It sang out, low and deep. Then a thinner steel rod, sharp, quick. Steve lined them up and tapped again, building a rhythm. Christopher's eyes lit up. He pressed his hands to the bench, then to the metal. A slow smile, not polite, not reflexive. A real smile bloomed across his face. It was the first time Victoria had seen that smile in over a year. She watched from the second-story window, coffee forgotten in her hand, breath caught in her throat. She didn't understand the science. She didn't care. All she knew was that her son was alive in a way he hadn't been before. Her mind told her this was ridiculous. The man was a gardener, not a therapist, not a teacher, certainly not a miracle worker. But her heart whispered something else entirely. Steve never touched Christopher, never pushed. He let the boy come close at his own pace. He let discovery lead the way, like God had handed him the blueprints for a language no one else had tried to learn. The household began to shift. Christopher stopped resisting bath time, started sleeping through the night. Victoria, for the first time in months, slept more than 3 hours without waking in panic. She didn't make a formal decision, but one morning she told Diane, "Let Steve use the tool shed for whatever he needs, and bring him lunch from the kitchen every day." But peace, as always, attracted whispers. "The gardener's overstepping," murmured a housekeeper. "I heard she let him rearrange the south lawn for the boys' lessons. Doesn't she know how that looks?" The whispers reached the hallway outside Victoria's office, then the ears of board members who called to check in. She waved them off, let them talk. But one night, after Christopher had gone to bed, she lingered at the kitchen table long after the wine had gone warm. Her phone buzzed, a message from a longtime colleague. "You're being reckless. You don't know this man." Victoria stared at the screen, her throat tightening, and for the first time in weeks, doubt found a crack in her newly forming peace. The day started like the others. Steve arrived just after sunrise, toolbox in hand, worn Bible tucked beneath his arm. He always read a few verses before he began, not aloud, just quietly, head bowed beneath the oak tree. Victoria had seen him do it from her window once. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit, not because she disapproved, but because it stirred something she hadn't felt in years. That morning, he brought something new. A speaker, small and square, wrapped in cloth. He buried it halfway beneath the soil in the southern garden, connected it to a low-frequency generator, and watched as the ground hummed faintly beneath his boots. Victoria stood nearby, arms crossed, skeptical. "It's just bass," she muttered. Steve didn't argue. He knelt and tapped the earth. Its resonance. Life begins in vibration. Genesis 1. And the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. You ever think about that? God moved before he spoke. Before she could reply, Christopher appeared. He walked toward the patch of ground slowly, eyes narrowed in curiosity. Steve turned on the speaker. A pulse trembled through the earth. Christopher froze, then knelt, placing both palms against the soil. A breath hitched in his chest. Victoria leaned forward. He feels it. Steve nodded. Watch. He adjusted the frequency. Lower, slower. Suddenly, before the next vibration could even reach his hands, Christopher's head jerked up. He anticipated it. Steve's eyes widened. Did you see that? Christopher stood. He took a few steps forward and crouched again, reaching not for the speaker, but toward the space just in front of it. His body knows it's coming. Steve whispered. Victoria's heart slammed against her ribs. That's not just feeling. No, Steve said. That's processing. That's sensory prediction. His brain's engaging the way it would with sound. He looked up at her, voice trembling with reverence. Something's waking up. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. In that sacred moment, neither of them noticed the figure watching from a balcony, a housekeeper with a phone, recording every second. The video leaked within hours. By the next morning, news vans blocked the gates. Headlines screamed about a miracle gardener healing a deaf millionaire's son. Reporters shouted into cameras, speculating wildly about what happened behind the estate walls. Victoria's private world imploded. She pulled Steve aside, panic rising. I didn't authorize this. I didn't ask for this. I know, he said gently. It wasn't you. We're not ready for this. He's not ready. They'll twist it. Steve nodded, which is why I need to go. The words struck her like a slap. No, she said, grabbing his arm. Not now. Not when. He's close, Steve said, his voice steady. Closer than anyone knows. But you have to protect this. Protect him. Don't quit now. Tears filled her eyes again, but she refused to let them fall. Christopher stood at the window, tapping the glass in a rhythm Steve had taught him. Victoria turned back to Steve, but he was already walking away. The house felt quiet after Steve left. Not peaceful, just empty. Christopher stopped going to the garden. He sat at the window again, still and blank. The smile Victoria had fought so hard to see flickered out like a candle in wind. She brought the therapists back. They brought charts, flashcards, hollow encouragement. Christopher turned away from them all. Victoria tried not to panic. She told herself it was temporary. Regression was normal. She told herself 100 things that sounded logical. But logic couldn't explain the ache in her chest when she heard silence. Not just the absence of sound, but of life. Days passed. Then came the board meeting. It was supposed to be routine. Quarterly earnings, market expansion, shareholder appeasement. Victoria wore her power suit, put on the war paint, and walked into the conference room like the queen she used to be. She had just begun her presentation when her phone buzzed. A nanny's name. Video call. She declined it. It rang again. She answered with clenched teeth. This is not a good time. The screen opened to chaos. Christopher was on the floor, shaking, hands over his ears though there was no sound. His eyes were wide, wild, like he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Miss Harrington. The nanny's voice trembled. He won't let us touch him. He's terrified. We don't know what to. Victoria didn't even think. She dropped the phone, walked out mid-sentence. Shareholders called after her in disbelief. She didn't care. She reached the estate in 21 minutes flat. She ran through the front door, breathless, heart pounding, ready for the worst. But the house was silent again. "Where is he?" she demanded. "In the garden," the nanny whispered. "He ran out there after." Victoria didn't wait. She found him near the fence line. Not crying, not shaking, just kneeling in the dirt, one ear pressed to the cold earth. "Christopher," her voice broke. He didn't turn. He just laid there, still, listening for a sound that wasn't coming. Not from machines, not from music, from Steve, from the vibrations he'd memorized. Victoria dropped to her knees beside him. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. I didn't know how much he mattered to you." Christopher blinked, but didn't move. She reached out, hesitated, then placed her hand gently over his on the ground. Nothing. No rhythm. No answer. That night, after Christopher finally fell asleep with exhaustion, Victoria stood alone in her office and stared at the headlines still swirling online. She picked up her phone. "Diane," she said, voice hoarse. "Find a detective." "Ma'am, I don't care what it takes. I want Steve Lamar found, and I want him safe." She hung up, then looked out at the garden, empty, silent, waiting. A verse Steve once muttered came back to her. "He leaves the 99 to find the one." Victoria didn't know much about faith, but she finally understood what it meant to lose someone who made the silence bearable. He didn't walk through the gate the way he left. Steve stood at the edge of the estate like a man visiting a grave, hat in his hands, shoulders heavier, eyes distant. Victoria met him on the front steps. She looked nothing like the woman who once ruled boardrooms without blinking. No heels, no blazer, just a mother who hadn't slept well in days. Hair tied back, voice raw. "I'm sorry," she said. Steve looked down, said nothing. "I should have protected you." "Him. Us." He finally raised his eyes. "I shouldn't have left." A long silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. "I didn't realize," she began, then stopped, swallowed. "I didn't realize how much you mattered to him, or to me." Steve nodded slowly, but his hands clenched tighter around the brim of his cap. "I loved someone once," he said quietly. "My wife, Maria. She lost her hearing near the end. I kept trying to fix it. Doctors, treatments, prayers, and I failed. I couldn't stop it. Couldn't save her." Victoria's breath caught. "You didn't fail." "I left here," he said, his voice shaking now, "because I thought I might fail again." The words hung there, fragile and true. "I don't care if you fail," Victoria said softly. "I just don't want to do this without you." That broke something in both of them. Steve nodded once, then stepped through the gate. The next morning, the ground hummed again, but differently. Steve brought a new tool, a high-frequency oscillator. Small, gentle. He placed it beneath the wooden plank where Christopher liked to sit. "Feel it?" he asked quietly, placing the boy's hand on the surface. Christopher tilted his head. Steve tapped a tuning fork. A soft, pure ring filled the air. Christopher's eyes widened. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward the sound. Steve exhaled like he hadn't breathed in weeks. Victoria, watching from a few feet away, covered her mouth with her hand. Tears escaped before she could stop them. They tried again the next day. A different note, a softer vibration. Christopher turned again. Each reaction was like a sunrise. Small, golden miracles inching across the horizon of a boy's world. Steve and Christopher developed their own rhythm. Not quite words, not quite silence. Just understanding. Victoria began sitting in the garden during sessions. Sometimes, she'd bring coffee and just stay. She asked questions, listened, even laughed once when Steve slipped on a garden hose and blamed the Holy Spirit for changing direction. She was changing too. Her voice softened. Her pace slowed. Her armor cracked. Late one evening, after Christopher had gone to sleep, she stood beside Steve in the fading light. "You know," she whispered, "I haven't let anyone into this part of my life. Ever." Steve didn't look at her, just nodded. "That's how I know it matters." Victoria stared up at the stars. She didn't know what tomorrow held, but for the first time in a long, long time, she didn't feel alone in it. It happened on a Tuesday. Clear skies, soft breeze. One of those mornings where everything felt still, as if the world had paused long enough for something sacred to happen. Steve knelt in the garden beside Christopher, guiding his fingers along the edge of a tuning fork. Victoria stood a few feet away, arms crossed, pretending not to hover. She was getting better at letting go. A little. Christopher tapped the fork, just like Steve showed him. A quiet hum vibrated through the wood beneath his palms. His lips curled into a proud little grin. Steve smiled back. "That's it, buddy. Just like that." Then, out of nowhere, clang. A sharp, high-pitched crash cracked through the quiet. Across the street, a government worker had dropped a long steel pole onto the sidewalk. Victoria flinched. Steve turned instinctively, but it was Christopher who moved first. He jerked his head toward the sound. Fast, intentional. His hand flew to his ear. His eyes widened. Victoria's breath caught. Steve was already kneeling beside him. "Christopher." His voice was soft, gentle, reverent. "Did you hear that?" The boy didn't speak, but he looked at them, then back toward the street. Then, slowly, like someone waking from a long dream, he touched his chest, then pointed toward the noise. Victoria stepped forward, tears already rising. "Steve, say it." Steve's voice trembled. His brain is learning to listen. She covered her mouth, fell to her knees beside them. Christopher tilted his head again, like he was chasing a sound he couldn't name, but somehow recognized. A thread of something real, something alive. Then it happened. He opened his mouth. At first, it was just breath, but then a soft, trembling sound broke through. Not a word, not even a full note, but something. A vowel, a cry, a fragile, beautiful syllable of existence. Victoria gasped. Steve's hand pressed gently to the boy's back, grounding him. "Do it again," Victoria whispered, eyes flooded. "Sweetheart, do it again." Christopher tried. A flutter of effort. A sound escaped, small, airy, holy, like the soul remembering how to speak. Steve blinked hard. "That's not just sound. That's hope." Victoria could barely breathe. "Is this real?" Steve nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. "It's more than real. It's redemption." For a long moment, no one said anything. The wind moved gently through the trees. A few birds chirped, unaware they had company now. Christopher looked up at the sky, eyes shimmering, then turned to Steve, and smiled. Victoria collapsed into tears. Not of fear, not even of relief, but worship. Pure, unfiltered awe at a God she wasn't sure she believed in, but who had somehow shown up in a garden, through the hands of a broken man and the heart of a silent child. "He opens the ears of the deaf," Steve whispered, almost in prayer, "and looses the tongues of the mute." Victoria reached for her son, pulled him close, and whispered into his hair. "You don't have to speak for the world to hear you, but I think you just did." Victoria used to wake to calendar alerts, conference calls, and crisis emails. Now, she woke to the sound of her son humming. It wasn't always in tune. It wasn't always even sound. Sometimes it was a vibration tapped into the floor with his heels. Sometimes it was a whispered syllable or a soft, breathy tone. But it was music. It was life. She'd canceled half her meetings, stepped down from 3 boards, and told her assistant the new rule. If it interferes with Christopher's progress, It doesn't belong on my schedule. The empire could wait. Her son could not. In the months that followed the breakthrough, Steve stayed. Not because he was hired, but because he belonged. Every morning, he knelt in the garden, working with Christopher using the rhythm-based method he'd quietly refined, a blend of vibration, movement, and now, cautious sound. A hybrid language only they understood. Steve became the anchor of the household, a steady presence, the man who knew how to calm a meltdown with a wooden plank and a tuning fork, who prayed over the flower beds like the soil needed scripture as much as sunlight, who never rushed a breakthrough and never claimed credit when one came. One evening, Victoria stepped out onto the patio where Steve and Christopher sat, gently tapping out vowel sounds on a makeshift soundboard. She cleared her throat. Steve looked up. "I have an offer," she said. His eyebrows lifted. "Not a salary," she clarified. "Not a contract." She walked closer, eyes shimmering. "A place. Here. Not a staff." Her voice trembled. "As family." Steve stared at her, stunned. Before he could reply, Christopher touched his arm. He opened his mouth. Soft, shaky, but clear. "Steve." It was his first word. Victoria covered her mouth. Tears streamed freely. Not the tears of exhaustion or loss, or even relief, but of witnessing the sacred. Steve's hand trembled as he reached for the boy, his voice breaking. "I'm here, buddy. I'm right here." Later that night, Victoria stood in the garden alone. She looked up at the stars, remembering every boardroom she'd conquered, every courtroom she commanded, every impossible thing she'd achieved with power, wealth, and sheer force of will. None of it compared to this. He who has ears, let him hear. She didn't know much about God, but if he was anything like Steve, quiet, patient, not needing applause, then maybe he'd been here all along. Not in the specialists, not in the spreadsheets, but in the gardener, the one the world never thought to notice, the man who listened to a child before the child could listen back. Victoria smiled through her tears, and for the first time in years, the silence no longer scared her. It sang.
Sometimes the miracle doesn't come through power or position, but through love, patience, and the one who kneels low enough to see what others miss. When this story fades from your screen, you have two choices. You can let it drift away like every other piece of content, or you can keep it alive for someone who needs it. Stories like this don't spread accidentally. They survive because someone like you chooses not to let them die in silence. If this touched even the quietest part of you, hit like so the algorithm understands this kind of hope matters. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because you never know whose darkness your share might brighten. Sometimes you are the child, sometimes you are the gardener, and sometimes you are the reason someone doesn't give up.